All right, so let's pick up here with the executive branch. Like I said, this is before the last presidential election, so we're going with President Obama and Vice President Biden for our purposes today. So the powers of the executive branch are in Article 2. Article 1, legislative. Article 2, presidential branch, executive branch, I'm sorry. These guys both serve 4-year terms, and they can be reelected once. So notice, these people have term limits, but there's no term limits on the legislative branch. This branch also includes the president's cabinet, who are his top advisors, of people that he asks to come and help him make decisions and give him advice. And those people that are in departments and agencies, and we'll talk more about them later on. The job of this branch of government is to carry out the laws that are passed by Congress, to execute the laws. That's what that means, executive branch, to execute the laws. The president has some other powers like directing foreign policy, which is important, and appointing ambassadors and treaties, negotiating treaties with other countries and things like that. He can work with Congress, as I said, to suggest laws, but he cannot introduce laws. Congress checks his power as far as ambassadors and his advisors, because everyone that he appoints has to be approved by Congress. So this is one of the things, this is a check on him by Congress. This is the way they can kind of control him a little bit. All right, the judicial branch is Article 3, and that sets up the judicial branch and the Supreme Court, which of course, is the biggest one, the highest one, and all the other little lower courts underneath it. The Supreme Court rules on difficult legal issues, and the rulings of the Supreme Court cannot be appealed. So once they have made a decision on something, that is the end of it. There is no changing that. Now, there is ways of trying to go back and making a law better. It's sort of like as if you had a rough draft. And so your teacher says the first time, your English teacher says, this isn't good enough. I'm rejecting it. And so then you say, okay, I'll try again. You can do something like that. But the first initial law, if the Supreme Court says no, well, that's it. It's no. All right, so that's what I just talked about, judicial review. So this power was not originally granted to them in the Constitution, and we'll talk later about how they got this power. Honestly, hint, hint, they gave it to themselves. But we'll talk about that later. It is an important power, though. It is the most important power they hold at the present, because they can actually literally decide if something is going to hold up and be a law or not. So the House and the Senate can send a bill to the president. The president can say, wow, this is the best thing I've ever seen. I'm signing it. It's a great law. And then for some reason, it ends up in the Supreme Court's lap. And if they say this is terrible, it's not constitutional, that is the end of it. It will not be a law. And so it's a pretty extreme power that they hold. And some people have questioned it. But again, it is a check that they can hold on the legislative and the executive branch. And so in its own way is probably a good thing to help keep the balance of power. It can also mean that the presidential action at the last bullet point, can decide if a presidential action is legal or not, because again, if something is brought before them and it involves a presidential action, they can decide, oh, this doesn't hit the mark. You can't do this thing. All right, so these justices are appointed by the president. Now, they have to be confirmed by the Senate, and that's not a sure thing. I can remember distinctly President Bush had to go back several times trying to find someone that the Senate would approve, because the first couple of picks he made, at one point, they're like, no, we're not having any of this. So it's not always a slam dunk that the president's going to get who he wants. Sometimes it's a question of, well, I really, really, really want this person, but the Senate's never going to approve them, so he has to move on to somebody else, or she has to move on to somebody else. Now, the justices serve for life. So they're not elected. Okay, so once they are there, there's almost nothing that can be done to get rid of them if you wanted to. I mean, mostly these people really are upstanding individuals and really, they're really pretty trustworthy and pretty good people. I mean, they're pretty much above being questioned as to their motives or anything like that. Honestly, they are. But even if they were questioned, it would be a very, very difficult process to try to remove one of them in my lifetime, it's never happened. It's never even been started. It's never even been thought of. And I'm pretty old, so it's a big deal. When you're a Supreme Court justice, that's probably the rest of your life you're going to be spending there. People can choose to resign or step down if they get old and then decide to retire, and that has happened. But it doesn't usually happen until they're really pretty old, okay? So the president has to be careful about who he picks because it's going to be for a long time. Right now there's only 8 justices. There's normally 9, but Justice Scalia died a couple years ago, and well, I don't know if it was a couple, like 18 months ago. Not quite, I'm sorry, my time reference is all messed up. But Scalia died within the last year or so, and because President Obama was near the end of his term, he at first tried to float a few ideas for Supreme Court justice, but the Senate was acting like they simply were not going to approve these people. And he, I think, himself decided that he would just wait until the next president was elected, because it would be a better thing for him to just wait until the people then voted again for the new president, and then the new president would be elected and could appoint a new justice. And then the Senate could go from there. Congress has the power to set the number of justices. We could change from 9 to more if we wanted to, but we don't. It's always been 9, at least as far as I can remember, it's been 9. All right, so the duties of the justices are to choose cases. Many, many people will try to bring a case before the Supreme Court, and they then will sit and read through these cases or have their clerks read through them and make suggestions as to whether they should hear them or not, because they can't listen to everybody's problems. So they pick and choose ones that they think are really of super importance to the country. And then they're asked to make a ruling on them. And in order to make a ruling on them, they will have people come and make arguments for and against whatever the thing is. And it's a huge honor to argue cases in front of the Supreme Court. And I have Senator Cruz's picture down there, not because of anything political, but because as our state attorney general, when he was our attorney general, he argued 9 cases in front of the Supreme Court and won almost all of them. So it was a distinct honor for him to be able to do that. And, you know, it's a big deal. If you hear somebody arguing a case in front of the Supreme Court, it is a huge deal to be able to do that. Okay, the rights of a citizen. So our rights fall into 3 categories. Protection from government, because we don't want them running all over us. Equal treatment, that means we should have the same treatment as everybody else. And the right to basic freedoms. The Fifth Amendment tells us that nobody should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. Now, if you think back, we've been talking about that for an awfully long time. If you think back, they were talking about that in 1215 with the Magna Carta. So these things that are in our Constitution that we're talking about right now about how we set up government, they weren't just dreaming them up. They were thinking back to the things that they thought were important, and the framers said, okay, well, these were some of our complaints, and so now we're going to address these in our Constitution and make sure that these things don't happen to us. And due process means that the government has to follow established rules. So if they're going to throw you in jail and take away your liberty, they have to follow a set of rules to do that. They can't just decide, I'm going to throw you in jail. At least they're not supposed to. There are cases in which this happens, and I will talk to you some about those in class, and I will point them out as they happen in history, because there are some presidents who have done such things and have gotten by with it. So usually it's in time of war, but I will point those out too, and we'll talk about those a little bit in class. But normally, under normal circumstances, this isn't what's supposed to happen. The 14th Amendment guarantees all people equal protection of the laws regardless of race, religion, or political beliefs. And we'll talk that the 14th Amendment is part of something called the Reconstruction Amendments, which we will study almost at the end of the school year. We'll study them in depth. But this was part of the Congress trying to make double sure that no one was going to be discriminated against again as far as voting rights or anything else. I will make a little aside. You will notice it says nothing about equal protection of the laws on account of whether you're male or female, because women still didn't have the right to vote. But we'll talk about that later on. Okay, the First Amendment, of course, you're familiar with, freedom of religion, press, assembly, petition. Now, the government can limit our freedom of speech or a right to hold a protest if it threatens public safety. So understand that your right to your freedom of speech and your right to assembly, if you are threatening public safety, if your protest march gets to the point where you are tearing down people's businesses, the police can certainly come in and shut you down, because now you are trotting on someone else's freedoms, which is the right to their property. So you have to be careful, because with your freedoms come responsibilities, and that is to understand that other people have freedoms too, and you can't be taking their freedoms away. Also, like I said, one person's rights can't take away another person's rights.